At the end of the rivers of the Nile lie a country synonymous with history, Egypt. The country, that is currently under the leadership of Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, is now only trying to bounce back after a tumultuous decade. But to give today's story context, we must start from the beginning. To what started one of Egypt's most tumultuous decade? The previous president of Egypt before Mohamed Morsi was Hosni Mubarak. He was from a military background and came to power after Anwar Sadat was assassinated. He was serving as vice president at the time. He then went on to rule Egypt for 30 years until he was forced to step down in 2011. Now, considering how his predecessor had lost his life, and how he came to power by being vice president, he sought to ensure that what had happened to his predecessor did not happen to him. He did this by never appointing a vice president for the entire time he was in office. By around 2000, Mubarak was almost 20 years into his presidency. There, however, did not seem to be a clear path of succession. Then in comes Mubarak's younger son Gamal Mubarak. Despite persistent denial, the elder Mubarak was clearly molding the younger to take over from him one day. He held a high position in the ruling party, the National Democratic Party. But the younger Mubarak bit off more than he could chew. In a show of political dominance that would backfire in 2010, he rigged the parliamentary system to give the National Democratic Party even more seats. This was the last straw. Egypt's parliament was the closest thing that the people had to a say on their country's future. 1 year later, the Mubarak government would be forced out, leading to the imprisonment of not only Hosni Mubarak, but his 2 sons also, who joined him in jail. That spark, however, as it burned, consumed not only those in power, but also more than a few without it. Egypt's economy was plunged into chaos. It would be almost a decade before some semblance of stability returned. They say history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. South of Egypt, where the Nile waters begin, is the people-rich country of Uganda. Like Egypt, it too has an aging president. He too is from a military background. He too has been in power for decades. He too is grooming his son to take over from him. If the political situation is not handled correctly, it could lead to unnecessary bloodshed. Not to mention the after effects. The world cared a lot more about Egypt's stability than it does Uganda, and it still took almost 10 years to get it back to some semblance of stability. How long do you think it would take Uganda if it is plunged into chaos? I would rather not find out. Uganda is one of the East Africa's biggest export and imports market. We would all be affected adversely were anything to destabilize our brothers and sisters. Not to mention the most important part. The East African Federation is the dream of prosperity and stability for the region. If Uganda were to fall into shambles, that dream would become deferred. Something that is even more unthinkable. A lot is said of African solutions to African problems. What do you think should be done to avoid adverse effects to the east of Africa?